Hello and welcome to the Wellbeing Evolution. We are sat here again in central Manchester. Disclaimer about the noise, or at least warning about the noise, that because we are in the middle of the city, there might be sounds of, protests, car alarms, etc. There's not much we can do about that, I'm afraid, other than get much more higher spec microphones, which might happen in the future, but we'll see. So I'm sat here with Dr. Richard again this week, and we are looking at determinism and free will. Or we're talking about it, I suppose. As I've said before, let's keep the tradition that I'm not going to just go into some monologue straight away. So, what do you think?
What do I think? Well, I feel like the first question is to consider what is typically meant by free will. What would you say people typically mean when they either think of the idea of free will or use that term?
I think, at least conventionally, I think it's based on a sort of loose and actually probably quite a vague concept that one is able to make their own choices freely. It's free will. So that there is an ability for people to make choices that is based on nothing other than our own, whatever we call it, our own mind, our own psychology, etc. And I think it's also sort of tied in with ideas of autonomy, self-agency, embracing aspects of our life that we can control, etc. I mean, none of those things are bad in themselves, but I think that the concept of free will is sometimes a bit entangled in those. And if you drill down into, let's say, an individual's concept of free will and really ask them, how does it work? It's often not, what I would call it's not a tidy concept. It's just made of vignettes of various aspects, but how does free will work? I mean, that is a big question in terms of how could it exist?
Yeah.
So let's say we explore the conventional kind of proposition, which is that we are free to make choices, like within our own capacity of mind, etc.
Yeah, and also the way you put it at the beginning was this idea of being able to make free choices. Because I think there's an important distinction between being able to make choices per se and being able to make free choices.
Yeah, I think, and you could even, peel back and say, well, how do you make a choice? Because even that's questionable, right?
Yeah.
Other than,
or can we make choices? I think more fundamentally,
exactly.
That's at the crux of this.
Yeah.
This debate of whether we have free will, or that question whether we have free will. I think a lot hinges on the question also of whether we can make choices. And I would argue, I don't know what you think, but I'd argue that it's possible for us to be able to make choices without having free will, in the sense of just being completely free of influences outside the self, and also of unconscious influences inside. Yeah,
I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? If you ask someone, does free will exist actually? Because whenever you're making a choice, whenever you're making a decision, whenever you're exercising your free will, if it's truly free, then that suggests that somehow we are separate from our environment, anything that we've ever experienced, all of the interactions that we've had, all of the influences of family and friends and social interactions, etc. How is that actually possible? To to be that, because actually, what is that? You know, as a being, how are you possibly separate from all of those things? And then, of course, if you're not separate from all of those things, can it really be described as free will? You know, because even if you're aware of, let's say, the influences that are, you know, present or, you know, active within oneself, you know, if you try and counter it, for instance, so try and do the opposite, well, that's also a question of, like, if you're actively choosing to do the opposite, then in a sense you're doing that independency of the thing that you're trying to, you know, counter. So again, there's, you know, it's in relationship to something you don't want to have to be influencing you, so you choose to try and do the opposite, but of course that's influencing you as well to do that. So there is a, you know, I mean, there's the question of what is a choice if we don't have free will.
Well, I suppose it's at this point it seems we're suggesting that if free will means that you can make choices in a vacuum, in a context where you're not being influenced by external factors, that's then we don't have it. And even if you could, it's difficult to even think up a situation where you could somehow be able to just make choices without being influenced by external factors, because no matter where you would find yourself, you're always in a situation, even if it's just a planet with no other people, and that's an influence, that constitutes the external factors. So we can never make choices in a vacuum, in a context where we're free from the influence of external factors, let's just say. But then the question still remains, well, can we still make choices? So can we, you know, in our context where we're always being influenced by external factors, and as you put it, always being influenced by the implications of whatever's gone before in terms of our previous experiences and all that. Do we still have agency? Do we still have an ability to make choices? I think that's the question people are concerned about when you sort of see, well, we can't have complete free will because we can't live outside of a context. But can we still make choices within that? Well, I suppose that's an important question.
I mean, I think you could invert the question and say, why would you want to be that, right? Like, why would we want to be make choices within a vacuum? Why would we want to direct or exercise our will completely separate from anything, so say external or whatever, however we describe it? Because that's, you know, the nature of reality. I don't think anyone would really argue against this, regardless of whether they're atheist or not, or, you know, is that phenomena is interdependent, right? Like, you know, all phenomena around us is only what it is by the grace of all the other things that are around it that give it the context, that give it the conditions that allow it to arise. So why would we be any different than that? And then, you know, it depends on what we mean by choice, because if we mean choice being a complete, you know, direction taken within a vacuum, even that is a statement that sounds contradictory, because a direction in comparison to what? You know, like, you can only have direction with two or more, right? If it's all a homogeneous whole and one, then where's the direction? You know, like, there has to be some sort of distinction, and then the fact that there is, like you say, giving that one example, even if you're on a planet, there's nothing else there. The presence of the planet is influencing you in some form. So it's kind of based in a kind of ideology that I think springs out of, you know, Cartesian, Newtonian determinism, you know, which has its uses in terms of trying to work out how to make trains and rockets and working out mechanical kind of strategies, etc. But it's not a description of reality. It's just a description of something that can have a utility to it in terms of making things, or in terms of designing things in the physical world context and the physical world on the macro level as well, right?
Yeah.
'Cause it doesn't work when you're trying to work with like quarks or neutrinos or whatever. So, you know, like we can have the experience of making choices, but I think if we try to then define making choices as something that's in a vacuum, then we're denying the reality of not even what we are, but of what phenomena is in general, right? Like you can't have that microphone there without other things around it. You know, you need other phenomena in order to support that in some form or another, and you know that goes for us too. So I can't really see I can't see the argument for how free will can exist in its conventional way of, you know, how it's conceived.
Yeah. So what would you say is a better way of thinking about it? This seeming ability we have to consider options hypothetically in our minds. So maybe I could walk home this way later, I could walk home that way, and sort of see these possibilities in your mind, and we seem to have an ability to reflect and then to make what you could call a conscious choice, where it's I'm going to go for this, and perhaps that can almost be defined as an ability to take premeditated actions, to think before acting.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can. If there's anything that could potentially be described as free will, I think we're probably looking more at something like Viktor Frankl's kind of concept of, you know, there's always an opening, there's always a space in between the perception of something and then our response to it. And I'd add to that in that there is there's a level of consciousness that can come into play in terms of our attention. Yeah. But not as an absolute. So what I mean by that is you can choose to pay attention to certain aspects of it, let's say an environment or an experience or a person. You know, like if you're having problems with a person, maybe it would help to pay attention to aspects of your life that you know they're having problems with, because that helps you have compassion for them, etc. But the question still comes back to, is it truly free will, or, you know, like how are we able to make that decision, or how are we able to shift our attention to things, and what's that based upon? You know, is that based upon a value system? And then where's the value system come from? Yeah, and for me, the question is why? Why do you make this decision rather than that? I think that because that's where, you know, if we pay attention to our minds closely enough, we can see, well, you're never in control of, you never quite know what's coming next in your own mind, and you certainly, it's not like you can ever get outside in some way, so you can choose, well, I'm going to have this thought next or that thought. They just sort of come along. And I always think of, I heard a Sam Harris podcast, and he gets his guests to, he says, well, think of a film. So if you think of a film in your head, and whoever's listening might think of a film in their head, and I'll think of one in mine. And so I get Grease,
Grease Lightning, that popped into my head there. What came into your head? And
American Werewolf in London.
Yeah,
it often does.
And I could say, well, why is that film popped in? And maybe you could say, well, it often does, but there's always going to be probably thousands of films that, in principle, that you're aware of could have come into your mind. So why that one should come up?
Yeah,
it's ultimately mysterious.
Yeah.
I mean, you might say, well, this film came into my head because and maybe that was because I watched it last night. It's fresh in my mind. But ultimately, if I then say, well, why that one and not that one? And also, the bottom line is, it wasn't in your. You didn't know before it came.
Yeah.
But there's still unconscious processes, aren't there? Which I would argue are still part of whatever it means to be a physical entity, such as the ones that we are. And I mean, I think my counterpoint to well, no, it's not necessarily a counterpoint, but something to point out is still that, well, as a physical entity, you can make choices, but it doesn't mean that you're in complete control of them. It's quite clear just from that example that unconscious processes are at least largely responsible for the choices we make. But that doesn't still leave us without an ability to make choices. It just means that we're probably far less in control of it than we think we are.
And again, I think that's also about what we really...
Or less consciously in control, I might say.
Yeah, and whether you can really define fully what the choice-making process is in some way. You know, I mean, it's like there's lots of neurological research on things like they've now found that many decisions that people claim they're making at the time, you know, I've made the decision, you can you can observe through various metrics in terms of like neurological activity that they actually made that decision 4 seconds prior to when they thought they made it. You know, so that's an implication on what is decision making in the first place. Then it's also an implication of where and how does it happen in terms of consciousness and unconsciousness. Yeah. And then also, you know, like I think we've mentioned this before, but there's varying kind of quotes on the quantity, but between, you know, I've heard between 96 or 99% of cognitive processes are unconscious. So that's also a question. And then I think the broad missing element that's often not considered in maybe Western philosophy more so is what is a being in terms of, you know, I think the Western kind of terminology would be the unconscious, right? But if we look at something like Taoism and Buddhism as well, you know, I mean, there's lots of aspects of those philosophies which describe a human being as having many unseen elements to them. Many elements of, you know, there's various levels of consciousness that are described in Dharmic religions. You know, I mean, the concept of the collective unconscious, you know, clearly, I think Jung and Freud were, as we know, you know, they were very interested in Eastern philosophy, etc. There's something in Buddhism called upaya consciousness. Right. And upaya consciousness is exactly what collective unconscious is. You know, it's exactly the same thing. It's the part of mind that is mind with a big capital M. That everything that takes place in your mind is kind of registered somehow, you know, and
so it's almost
maintained.
Like an orienting capacity or reflex or something that's enabling us to, or is the basis of why we might think this or think about this rather than think about that, or do this rather than do that. In other words, it's not like we're just some blank slate that is a puppet of external factors.
Yes.
So you could call that social determinism. We're just doing and thinking whatever we're doing and thinking because of the way that the world happens to be,
Yeah.
and the way that it's influenced. It seems that this idea of collective unconscious is the idea that we've got, we're not blank slates basically. We're oriented towards certain things and perhaps not towards others so much.
Yeah, I mean, that tabula rasa kind of concept, it also comes out of, I would say, the perspectives of, philosophical perspectives of determinism, of, unless it's the determinism of theology, like a kind of teleological kind of determinism, then it can only be really atheistic, and possibly even I could stretch that and say nihilistic. There's just literally no. It's just all chaotic interactions of molecules, and that's all that's going on. And coming back to this concept of the East, which is that what's taking place in us is not simply an individual subjective experience. One of my favourite points that Jung was always trying to get across, and there's a long record of him on YouTube that people can find if they so wish, of an interview. And one of the things he says in that is, we're not of yesterday or today, we're of an immense age. And that in itself is a statement saying that we're not separate. Our minds are not kind of these simplistic kind of sponges, or just a collection of influences that have come together in some sort of confluence, and there you go, there's a human being.
And during our lifetime, we're not just merely a product of whatever we've experienced and whatever's happened to us. It seems that Jung's point now is suggesting that whatever we are, why we are the way we are, why we think the ways we do, why we do what we do, might largely be because of the situations we find ourselves in and the way that our own experiences have shaped us. But it's also, importantly, because of
what's come before,
millennia of evolution that has shaped our physical, our constitution as physical beings.
Well, there's even even conventional science and so let's say conventional psychology acknowledges this. Epigenetics and genetics is also an expression of that, right? And concepts like generational trauma, like the. You could argue that that's passed on through interactions rather than simply unconscious processes. Even then, interactions. If we accept the concept of the unconscious, not even the collective unconscious, but just the unconscious, then there's no way that that's not operating when it comes to rearing a child, for instance. So those influences are going to be there as well. And to claim that any of us are free from the influences of our either immediate family or ancestors, etc., I think is woefully naive, I would say. And I think that it comes back down to, it's not that we can't make decisions, it's not that we don't have choices, but I think we should be careful about what concept we have about what are those things. That you're not just simply sat down in a vacuum, or on an island, or whatever sort of metaphor we come up with, and making a decision. It's not just. I suppose from that concept, it's not just us making the decision. It's almost all of us in terms of our influences. We're just I kind of sometimes think, we're the sharpened point of the pencil of all of those influences. We're the one that's making the mark in the world, but there's there's plenty more behind that, you know, of the pencil. The sharpened point is only a tiny percentage of that, you know, and that's also a reflection again. I mean, we keep referring to Jung, but I think he nailed it in so many ways. It's difficult to not refer to him in these sort of, I think when you're talking about mind, especially from a Western perspective, you know, I mean, he was famous for sort of saying that people don't have ideas have people, you know, and that is really, I think, very much something that every individual should really think about. I mean, I noticed this when I was young, was that, and I remember joking with a friend about it at one stage. We realised that sometimes when we were given opinion about something, it wasn't our opinion, it was an opinion that we'd heard. You know, and children do this all the time. You know, when I used to teach, you could hear in the way it was being presented that the child didn't really, it wasn't through their own processes that they come to that opinion. They were just voicing what they'd heard. But out of the vastness of all of the opinions that there could be, or the lack of any concept that I hold at all on a subject, I hear one opinion, and then you can almost think that that's your opinion, you know. And so it's questioning all of the things that we think, so to speak, or decide. Are they ours? You know, I mean, I think I described possibly in the last video that an exercise I often do with clients is we look at values,
Right.
and we look at, you know, I use, there's like 72, you know, values represented on cards, and we'll look at what they decide are their core values. You know, I get them to whittle it down to 12 or sort of 10 to 12 out of those 72, and you know, a big focus and question over that process is that your value, or is that a value that you think is something that will just have an almost unanimous agreement of either society, your family, your friendship group, etc. And then really question that, like, is that really important to you? Is that really of core importance?
Yeah, well, another way of putting a question to them could be, have you really thought about that? In other words, because what would it mean for that to be genuinely that what they value or their value? To me, it would mean that, well, where it's come from, they've thought about it, and they've been critical of it, and still thought, yeah, this is, I do wholeheartedly value this. So it's sort of almost like it's not just an idea, but it's something that's more deeply integrated. So it's actually a part of them, in the sense that they genuinely believe and live by it, as opposed to perhaps just think, yeah, well, in principle, I think it's bad to eat animal products. Let's say you might think that's the truth. But you might not live by it. You might not. So that would suggest you don't really believe, or maybe you believe it's bad, but you don't believe it's bad enough, so that it's going to influence your actions.
Yeah, I mean, that would be the case. I think we've talked before about people that will say that health is really important, or fitness is really important. It's like, okay, what are you doing that reflects that? Yeah.
And I think it was also Jung that said, I believe, that if you want to know what someone believes, don't bother asking them, just see how they act. See what they do. Because that's going to tell you more what they believe, more about what they believe than they might, or that they might be able to. Because we might think, well, this is what I believe in, or that's what I believe in, but really our actions can suggest otherwise. I mean, I think that's often something that's confronted in the therapeutic process, is, you know, that kind of, like, you know, what I would describe sometimes as the myth of me. You know, like these concepts that we walk around with of ourselves and who we are, and who we believe ourselves to be, without really reflecting on, like you say, like our own actual behaviours, like what are we actually doing, how are we actually interacting, how are we actually treating others. And it's like, you know, because you can get people that might consider them
like there's various terms that have come and gone. You know, I mean, nowadays people use the term woke, right? But in my day, it was more like someone that was right on. You know,
right.
And there may be they might have all sorts of political views and all the rest of it, but that all seem very like, you know, ethically thought out and moral and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
But actually, in terms of their general demeanour and the way they are with people, they could just be an arsehole, you know.
Yeah.
And that's what's not being considered, is they're going around kind of self-describing as being this kind of like highly moral, highly thought out, ethical person who just conducts themselves perfectly all the time. But what's really going on in you, you know, like how are you relating to other people? What do you actually think another human being is?
Yeah.
Because a lot of that can be, what I would say is like a lot of bubbling resentment underneath there that has resulting behaviour, but that behaviour will then be justified by the ideology that they're, you know, giving their mouthpiece for.
Yeah.
But not, it's not actually touched their heart, you know, to give it a kind of bit more of a sort of new agey term, you know, like they're not embodying the perspective that they're describing, you know. A bit like some, you know, maybe you get someone who's like, I don't know, a staunch vegan or something, but actually there could be like a real misanthrope. And so, okay, maybe a staunch vegan would claim, well, that's fine because I'm doing it for the animals, etc. But if you can compartmentalise what they accuse meat eaters of doing, right? Like, why can you compartmentalise another human being or your pets as being not subject to being eaten, but you know, you see a pig or whatever and you think, oh, that's fine to eat. But, you know, I could invert that argument and say, well, why do you think that, you know, human beings could be so easily dismissed? And, you know, why do you struggle so much with close relationships with other human beings if it's all about, you know, warmth, compassion and love? So yeah, that's just an example of someone that has a self-description that is not necessarily embodied at all. And that, I'm not kind of like attacking vegans, because plenty of them are like that. But
well, it's just an example, isn't it? So I suppose, you know, linking it back to psychotherapy and the psychotherapeutic implications of this conversation, it seems like from what we're talking about in the last few minutes, that this ability to think with other people, but also in our own heads, to have conversations with ourselves, while we've agreed it doesn't give us free will, in the sense that it enables us to make choices that are independent of external factors and that aren't heavily reliant on unconscious factors. It's important, it seems, in terms of helping us to integrate to integrate what we believe in, what we value, to the point where it's not merely just an idea that it's good to eat less meat. Let's say the role of the conscious processes, we might say, is to provide us with a space where we can think, we can reflect on this value or that value, and why we might be wise to value this rather than that, and that helps us to I don't know, but the best way of putting it, feel more of a stronger sense of wholeness as an individual, so that we're not just because I suppose otherwise we could just be fragmented, because there's lots of things we can potentially value, or lots of relationships in our lives we could potentially value, but until we really think about it and evaluate things and weigh them up via conscious processes, then we perhaps are not able to get the sort of psychological stability that we might need, so that we can have psychological well-being and not psychological pathologies.
I mean, I think that, you know, talking about things being fractured, I think that is that's in some ways the issue of a conventional perspective on free will. Because if it's possible for us to fracture ourselves to a point where we can make decisions in a vacuum and separate ourselves off from the rest of the world in some way, or the rest of influences, then that's not a to me at least, that's not a description of someone who's integrated. Like, it should be more that we're drawing on all of the qualities and the benefits of our influences, rather than sort of attempting to put ourselves in a box and separate off and then say I've made a decision. It was more like drawing on. I mean, I suppose in some ways I keep having this phrase coming to me, and it's not actually a phrase that I use often, and maybe I've never used it, I'm not sure, but it's almost like drawing on or calling on the ancestors to make a decision. What I mean by that is the acknowledgement of what we are, that we are not just this kind of like frozen particle or point in time that is simply a separate result of history. That history is present in us as well. It's not like I'm a sort of can that's been kicked up the road kind of thing, and I'm separate. They're all connections.
We have a nature, is what it seems you're getting at. We're not obviously we're heavily influenced by whatever we experience, both in the present moment, but in terms of what has gone before in our own individual life. But we don't start off a blank slate. We have a nature which it has been shaped by however long humans have been, whatever it is, whether it's humans, continual process and we're the latest emergence of it. We're the end of the latest end of the pencil, as you put it. So I guess this suggests that to achieve psychological well-being, to achieve psychological integration, do we then need to both be considering the external world as it is to us now, and the way that's influencing in us, and what it might expect of us, which we can be critical of, and we need to consider that, the social side, you might say, but we also need to consider what are we like as beings, also through no choice of our own. What needs and what ways, what natural inclinations or orientations might there be in human beings that also need to be considered when it comes to how should we navigate and move forward, and what should we value. Could be something to add to that. It's not just a matter of, well, what does society think I should value? It's also, well, what am I like as a being who as we're suggesting, isn't a blank slate, isn't just merely a puppet of whatever the society you've been into happens to have made you.
And I think that's the values aspect is important in many ways, and it's also important to question where they're coming from, as in maybe they're not, it's not just a case of free will what I value. Maybe it's the case that those values are inherently important. That I've not chosen that they're important.
But nor has society just socialised them into you necessarily. I think we'd all agree that society matters. The world that you've experienced has shaped you, it continues to shape you, but it seems you're suggesting that that's not all there is to it. There can be inherent values, or indeed there are inherent values. What exactly they are might be more difficult to articulate, but they might matter just as much as anything that you might feel society expects of you or has taught you to value.
Or more. you know. Like, I think that, you know, you know, the concept of the Übermensch is kind of like a reflection of that, you know, the Nietzsche's sort of suggestion that it's actually important for you as an individual to carve out your own value system, but not. Yeah, of course. Then some people might say, "Well, you can only do that with free will," but I would say yes, but you also need the. I suppose it's also a distinction between free will and recognition of things that are phenomena or qualities or values that are already present. Right? Yeah, and that's an attentional thing as well. And it's a bit like, you know, Joseph Campbell said something similar. You know, that I can't remember the exact quote. I might be paraphrasing slightly, but he was sort of saying, you know, there is the dreams and the myths of society, and then there's the individual myths, and which are our own dreams. And he says, I can't remember exactly how he puts it, but he says something like, you better make sure you choose the right one to follow. Yeah. You know, like, i.e., if you just succumb to society's standards and values and expectations of you, then you're going to be living a life that's essentially dictated by that. Whereas if you search and become aware of your own qualities and your own values through your dreams, then you're going to be more aligned with whatever produces well-being. So of course some people might then argue, well, that would be a description of well-being, of free will, right? Because you don't allow society to influence you. But I'd argue no, because what he was suggesting was that you pay attention to your dreams. It's not just that you sit there and you kind of think something up. It's that you pay attention to part of yourself that you cannot see. You know, coming back again to this sort of concept of yin and yang, right? So the part of us, the part of reality, and the part of the self that is not detectable, but nevertheless has very strong influence, and nevertheless can sometimes release or information, so to speak, emerges from,
manifest itself in dreams, for example. So in other words, it is detectable, you might say, but not directly detectable. In other words, it's going to manifest itself. Perhaps, dreams is a good example. So why do the things come to you in dreams come to you? And one argument could be, that's the unconscious process is trying to make themselves somewhat indirectly detectable through the dream.
And then of course the debate would be, where do unconscious processes end? And I think let's say the more humanistic, atheistic perspective that may be embodied in certain therapies would be, they end where the individual starts and ends, kind of thing. Whereas, you know, I would say what my concept of unconscious processes is that there's also phenomena such as the collective unconscious, such as, you know, the Tao or whatever someone wants to describe it as, that is transpersonal. It's not just my own personal psychology, and that's in a sense that's the main point I'm trying to make about free will or people making choices and decisions, is that you're making choices and decisions, yes, from your own psychology, but also from our history, our ancestry, our, you know, epigenetics, of all of those influences.
Which is inseparably linked to your individual psychology as you experience it, as are the social side of things, the experiences you've had, the people who've influenced you. It's all always at play.
And I think that's like, not if you ask someone to really think about it, it's not an unreasonable thing to say.
No,
you know, it's
not at all.
Like a plant, right? You know, a plant is what it is because of all of the other influences that are around it, and you can't just pull the plant out and say, I think I might like put it up there on that shelf. It's like you've got to consider the conditions that in place that need to support that.
Yeah.
And
another way of looking at it is the plant has the potential to become what it can become. It has this inbuilt potential, this inherent potential, an orientation, natural orientation towards growth and development. It's quite evident if you think about how a plant comes to being, but it can't just exist, or it can't just flourish in any circumstances. It has to be, as you said, in the right spot. It's got to be nurtured. But it's just like us, you can say. It's not a blank slate. It has an inbuilt potential. The plant can't just become anything it wants. It can't become a sofa. It's not going to naturally develop into a sofa. It sounds ridiculous, but it can naturally. It does have a natural tendency to develop into to what it can become. And humans perhaps can be thought of similarly.
I mean that is. There's a I would say a lot of misunderstanding about science when it comes to things like teleology, for instance. I mean, there's the little known fact that Darwin celebrated the origin of species by describing it as a synthesis of teleology and science. He didn't think that there was no purpose or teleological kind of aspects to nature, but somehow it got kind of usurped by a kind of atheistic, nihilistic kind of let's say ideology, but that's not how Darwin described it. And I think that, like you say, that plant in a way has its own teleology, right? It has its own potential and direction that it's going to take.
And one way to put it simply would be it's oriented in terms of translating what we mean by teleology. It's oriented towards you could just say life, towards the fulfillment of its potential to live and to grow, and I think humans can be thought of similarly. Obviously, humans goes without saying much more complex, and what a human can become, there's a far wider range of possibilities. But I suppose the point is that some things we can become, or some ways of being that we can become, or orientate ourselves towards, are going to be more conducive to our flourishing as humans than others. And so I suppose the role in psychotherapy is perhaps then from your perspective, are you helping the client along that road, helping them to figure out how they need to orientate themselves to further their psychological development and to avoid pathologies or just unhealthy ways of thinking about things and behaving?
I mean, I think that what I'm helping them to do is to recognise, I mean, I suppose, to recognise themselves, really, to recognise their own quality, your own traits, your own tendencies, but also your own qualities, and also recognising the value or the benefit to those recognition of your own qualities, right? Like, so that you can start to identify more with some of your positive qualities, rather than I mean, I think that a common issue that a lot of clients will turn up with is that they're I would say in some ways overly emphasizing or overly identifying with negative experience that they've had. And that, of course, I'm not saying they should just forget about negative experience, but what I mean is, if you start to build an identity around yourself, around those negative experiences, that almost to the point where they become the center of your concept of self, then like, we can never expect to ever really let's say achieve well, you're talking of potential, achieve our potential, because they're inherently a drag factor to our self-esteem. They're inherently like what I would say is sort of like an energy vacuum. You know, you hemorrhage energy over those negative experiences, especially if you are primarily turning it into an identity, you know, rather than something that was, you know, maybe horrific, maybe traumatic, maybe very painful, that has happened to you, but that doesn't define you. You know, it doesn't not, you know, what I mean by that is it doesn't not define you either, in terms of some aspects of your experience can never be, you know, you don't have to forget about them.
Yeah, and you can't escape the fact that they happen.
They've happened.
You can think about them differently, which is, I guess, your role is to give people other ways of thinking about things, because that's both the negative thing about the fact that we're influenced by external factors, but also the positive. It's like, well, a person, because of their experiences, might not know, it might just never occurred to them for whatever reasons, that it's possible to interpret that breakup or this trauma differently. Whereas when they speak to someone else, and especially with a therapist, they're going to get another perspective, which can literally give them new ways of seeing whatever it is that is giving them difficulties, and they might not even be aware actually that this way of thinking about whatever it is giving them problems or causing them distress,
or that the alternative is possible. You know, like, and again, you know, I mean, there's an element of question about free will there. You know, like, maybe they could hold the concept of alternative ways of looking at something, but simply coming into the therapy room and discussing it with someone else suddenly makes it seem way more possible. And then, of course, the question then is, what is that in regards to free will? Because they had the concept before, but somehow they couldn't access it or couldn't embody it in some way. Then they share it with another human being, and then suddenly that releases it in some way. You know, is that free will? You know, like, well, is that something else playing out there? And, well, I mean, I would argue it's something else playing out there, right? I'd argue that it's to do with interaction and collaboration between two human beings, that it's just not possible for us always to do as an isolated human being, you know.
Yeah, and I suppose another way of thinking of it from the person's perspective who thinks, well, there's no free will, there's nothing I can do can really matter. It's like, well, try actually living like that. Just try and sit and think, well, there's nothing I can do. And all of a sudden you sit there long enough, you get bored or you get hungry, and you find that you're naturally driven to do something or other. So there the question arises again, well, what should I do? And for the person who might be considering therapy, it's like, well, you don't know what could emerge through that encounter with someone else who's actually going to listen, give you some new things to think about maybe. You don't know what can emerge through that until you go and give it a go. And as I'm suggesting now, that as I see it, there's no real option just to sit around and give up. The only ways for things to get worse or to get better, if you sit around and don't do anything, and you're either going to get hungry or fed up. Sooner or later, something's going to. You can't just sit there forever, or you can try, but sooner or later there's going to be severe discomfort at the very least. So the question is, well, what might I do that might at least avoid letting things get worse? And the bottom line is, you never know what's going to come through. For example, going to a therapy session, or just talking to a friend. But that's the potential in it. That's why it's worth finding out.
And not, I mean, having the attitude that there is growth and potential, and there's an openness to a situation is really important. And I think that is, the concept of free will might sound great and open, but in another way, if it's also implicitly describing the individual as being this separate unit, then that's actually, I think, a lot of the time counterproductive to growth. Like, when people are more, let's say, feel more balanced, feel more positive, feel more productive, feel more energized, there's a condition in there that's nearly always present that they'll describe, that they feel more connected in some way to the world, or to people, or to their family, or to their partner, or to their family. And that's the perspective on an individual as just being kind of able to just cut themselves off into a vacuum. I don't think the two really match up, really, so.
And that itself is one way of looking at that as well, is that their world is literally changing. If they've, or it literally has changed, they feel more connected, probably because they quite literally are. They've gone out and spoken to someone else, at least maybe perhaps numerous other people, and something worthwhile has been coming from that. And I think it comes back to that original point. Well, that's partly why you don't have free will, in the sense we were describing at the beginning. You don't have that because you are always more or less connected to other people. And I suppose the thing to be aiming for is connection, more healthy connections, basically. Connections that are more conducive to your psychological well-being, and to seeing that as a process that's ongoing. So no matter what the situation, there's always the potential to try and, as I put it earlier, at least avoid letting things get worse for yourself. So how can I orientate myself towards this growth, this life, this from the plant's perspective, it's the fulfillment. Not that a plant necessarily has perspective, another conversation, but towards orienting itself towards a fulfillment of its innate potentials.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the connection. The connection is the missing part of the conventional concept of free will, I would say. And rather than thinking I must exercise my free will, because I think that's where sometimes people can get into trouble, especially like young kind of, if you're very idealistic, or people that kind of get very like internalized and introverted, a lot of the sufferings come out of they've got some real strong injunction on themselves about connection, about intimacy, about asking for help, about sharing things with other people, and there's like, no, I'm going to do it all by myself. I can do it. I don't need anyone else. And I mean, that's like, I'm going to exercise my free will, etc. And it's like, you're kind of again, it's kind of like this denial or dismissal of the way things are, or the way human beings are, is that we're creatures of connection, and that applies regardless of whether you're a hermit living in a cave or you're some sort of mystic living in a cave. They will still be asserting the concept of connection. They're not like, if you go off and find some Buddhist yogi in a Himalayan cave, I know from my own experience that they will very much be focused on the lineage that they come from, the teachers that they've had, especially their guru, obviously. And so there's, regardless of whether they're off like in isolation, their concept of self and the concept of what they're doing is very much in connection. It's not about, I'm going to go off into a cave and exercise my free will. Maybe on that note we can.
Yeah, well, I think there's plenty to come back to in that conversation with dreams and Jung and lots of other things.
Well, I think we crisscross quite a lot. Areas that we can touch
I think
on.
that's the kind of conversation also easy to go on all night with that kind of one.
So thanks for watching if you have been, or thanks for listening if you've probably more likely been. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. We're trying to get this channel off the ground and have good conversation, really, talking about things that at least we think matter. We assume there's people out there that think they matter. Our next episode we're quite excited about, because we're going to go off and interview a very, what could we say, a very energetic, embodied, conscious 90-year-old lady who still goes to clubs till 2 or 3 in the morning, and you'll see her up and about by 9 a.m. the next day, very lucid, very clear. And so we're just going to go and talk to her and ask her what her secrets are, and it's going to be a free form thing, really. We're just going to, she's a very articulate lady, so she can just talk, and we'll just be there sometimes to ask various questions. So please join us if you can. Thank you.